of the other, let me highlight number of national nutrition plans that refer to climate. There are over 100 national nutrition plans. Hardly any of them refer to climate in any meaningful way. Let me look at 2.4. Global Nutrition Report tracks nutrition promoting climate adaptation actions. There are 380 commitments that governments, businesses, and others make on nutrition that are tracked in the Global Nutrition Report, but only 20 of them even mention climate. How many healthy diet campaigns also refer to sustainability? How many countries with food control systems are looking at food safety risks associated with climate change? And then what's the value of Green Climate Fund initiatives that include nutrition? What's the value of ODA to climate that is linked to nutrition? So these are the indicators that we are trying to establish baselines for. In doing the baselines, it's not a simple yes, no. We have levels of integration or interconnectedness. So level 1 is no connectedness whatsoever. They really are ships that pass each other in the middle of the night. All the way through to level 5, which is there's a commitment to mobilizing resources with plans to undertake action. And 2, 3, and 4 are intermediate. Some initiatives may just sort of casually mention climate nutrition in the preamble, that's level 2, but they never go forward to level 3 and 4 to actually declare an intent to do something with these two together. So that's what we're trying to do. This is, I want to say, this is completely hypothetical. I've just made these numbers up, so please don't take them as evidence. They're just illustrative. I've picked 4 indicators from the 25. This is what the scorecard will look like. We reviewed 100 climate NAPs, National Adaptation Plans, for adaptation to climate change. 60 of the 100 were on level 1, 2 of them are on level 5. We might want to develop a target which says by 2030, 50% of those NAPs will be at level 5 by 2030. I don't know what that 20 is, that's a typo. Similarly, for the Global Nutrition Report, this is an actual number. We've tracked 380 GNR commitments. Those of you who know the Global Nutrition Report, it's the main nutrition accountability mechanism globally. But these numbers are made up. Let's say 5 of them are level 5 of the 380, and 300 of the 380 don't mention climate at all. They're level 1. So a target for that might be that 50% of these GNR tracks or commitments are at level 5 by 2030. 3.3, number of countries that factor climate into food procurement decisions for food. This is for social protection programs, for schools, for the justice system, for the health system. Again, review 100 countries. We find at the moment 80 are on level 1. Only 1 of them seriously integrates climate and nutrition. What's the target? Again, I'm just making these numbers up. 50% of countries at level 5 by 2030. The development of the targets, as you can appreciate, is a technical one, but mainly it's political, and it's about negotiation between countries and international organizations. And then value of Green Climate Fund initiatives that include nutrition considerations. There's been $10 billion US dollars of investment in the Green Climate Fund since 2010. What's the percent of that is at level 5? Let's say 1%. Let's say we want 30% of that to be at level 5 by 2030. We had the first workshop on this early this May, and we attracted interest from a number of member states, mostly OECD countries, and we need to do better to attract interest from especially African and Asian countries. But we're very early in the process. What's the value add to the COP28 the other food system initiatives at COP28? The COPs are awakening to food. COP27 was the first one that really took food seriously. I think COP28 will take food systems seriously. This initiative really brings in new entry points for climate, because nutrition is wider than just food, right? We know that nutrition requires food security and good food, nutritious food, but it also requires good water and sanitation and good health systems. So this This brings in, and water, this brings in additional entry points for climate. We are going to leverage the existing mechanisms that the climate community focuses on. So NAPs, GCF, ODA, national policy, and IPCCs. Sorry about the alphabet soup. The metrics really track concrete actions and decisions. We are really determined to avoid fluff and blah, blah, blah. We want to really hone in on things that matter and can be measured, so meaningful and measurable. And the target setting process, which hasn't started yet, will be no doubt contentious, but will raise awareness in some or many member states. This is who ICANN is. It's part of a bigger climate and health initiative called ATTACH, which is the Alliance for Transformative Action on Climate and Health. That was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. ICANN kind of brings in the food and nutrition dimension to that, and it's a subset of the ATTACH initiative. It's a working group of ATTACH. Again, and the government of Egypt are the co-chairs of that, and FAO and WHO are key secretariat members. We do need additional members from the climate community, and we have a work plan until COP28. This is probably too much detail for you to provide, but we've got a number of workshops. We've got an event at the World Health Assembly next week in Geneva, talking to member states. We are presenting at FAO. We'll be presenting at the UN Food System Stocktake, which is the 2 years after the UN Food System Summit, and so on and so forth. The Committee on Food Security, and of course at COP we will be finalizing the baseline paper, which will have data for all 25 of those indicators, and then we will present that at COP, and then we will hope that COP28 will kick off a process of establishing targets, which will no doubt be a long and lengthy and deeply frustrating, but hopefully fruitful process. So that's all I have to say, colleagues. It's taking an idea. There should be more collaboration between climate and nutrition, because by doing that, we can advance both faster than if we don't do that, and saying, how do you make that more real? How do you assess where we are right now? How do you develop targets? And how do you monitor progress towards the targets in a way that is empowering rather than punishing? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Lawrence, for that wonderful talk. So now we're going to come back into the room, and we have Alok Ranjan for our next talk. So you take the stage.
Thank you. Post-lunch session, and that also after Lawrence's presentation is going to be really difficult to follow on. Thanks, Lawrence, for that wonderful presentation on the nutrition and the climate link. Good day, everyone, here in the room as well as online. I'm Alok. I'm the Director of Programs and Investments at the Power of Nutrition. Really very happy. I don't have any slides, no presentation as such. I have these few papers that I'll be talking from. The topic that I was given was new finance mechanisms, and I'm not sure if folks can hear online. That's fine.
Yeah, it should be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me start by talking about three numbers. One is 4C. Lawrence hinted towards that, where we are talking about the conflict, the climate change, the cost of living crisis that's happening, and this whole pandemic with COVID. When we look at this whole thing, it makes the topic of the new financing mechanisms that we are looking at from the nutrition angle, but globally in terms of overall development sector, it's something which is impacting majority of the development sector areas right now. So that's 4C, which is really impacting a lot in terms of where we are looking at funding for our programs and our different partnerships. Second number I'd like to say is 2 is equal to 17. Of course, 2 is not equal to 17, but when you look at SDG 2, it is something which is which helps contribute towards achieving all the other SDGs. So it's not that SDG 2 achievement only contributes to SDG 2. It enables SDG 17, all others to achieve. At the same point of time, what we do through other SDGs, whether it's working on WASH component, whether it's working on health aspects, they all contribute towards one way or the other in terms of the achievement of the SDG 2 also. So that's where the second number that pops to mind is 2 is equal to 17. And third number that pops to mind is 1 is not equal to 45. And that's how underfunded we talk about nutrition as a sector. It's sometimes called out as an orphan sector in terms of, if you look at the number, 45% of all under 5 mortality deaths in children who are less than 5 years of age, 45% of those deaths are attributable to one or the other form of undernutrition. Whereas if you look at the ODA funding that goes for addressing nutrition problems, it's less than 1%. So there is a massive imbalance in terms of what is needed and what is the burden, as well as how much funding is going towards that entire ecosystem. The latest number that has been there around the funding gap, especially for the nutrition specific core interventions, is that there is a gap of around 10.8 billion US dollar every year for just the core nutrition interventions globally. This is investing framework around nutrition. That was something that World Bank and many other partners have worked on. So this is the gap that's there. If you look specifically to goal 2, SDG 2, which is around zero hunger, the gap is even much bigger because addressing zero hunger is not just nutrition specific interventions. It encapsulates nutrition specific, sensitive, a lot of interventions and a lot of food systems aspects come into picture over there. And there the gap are estimated to be ranging from even 40% to 40 to 50 billion US dollar per year. So that's where the problem statement is when we're talking about new financing for nutrition and what is the magnitude that we are looking at. Where does the power of nutrition come into mix of all this is after the Nutrition for Growth Summit that happened here in London in 2013, that's where the genesis of the power of nutrition happened. That's where then DFID, Children Investment Fund Foundation, CIF, and UBS Optimus Foundation, they came together to create the Power of Nutrition as a global foundation, which was looking at 2 aspects mainly, getting more funding for nutrition into the sector, getting more funding from the private sectors, from the non-traditional players as well, and creating more and more partnerships with different set of stakeholders, different funders, different implementing partners, bringing all of them together to create a more large-scale programs looking at scale, sustainability, as well as systems-driven approaches across Africa and Asia. That's where we came, our genesis came, and over a period of 7 years, what we have been doing is this exactly getting more funding into the sector of nutrition. We have now around 22 programs in 16 countries, and portfolio size, where a huge chunk of that amount is the IDA funding, which is coming from the World Bank. It's almost around 548 million US dollar across these 22 programs, and we are reaching around 133 million mother, adolescent, and children. That having been said, what is happening right now with this whole 4C, COVID, conflict, climate, and the cost of living, what it is doing is it is making life so much difficult for almost all the development sector partners, including us as well. And we have to now look at more avenues and approaches where there is funding and where we can go as a sector to draw more and more private sector funding and resources. What we have done is we did an analysis with Palladium Impact Capital over last 1.5 to 2 years, where we looked at where is the global ecosystem around the things around innovative financing, where are the opportunities around those, and what have been the opportunities that have been utilized around nutrition per se. Some startling numbers that came out of that is Forbes 500, top 500 companies. They invest almost $20 billion in their CSR efforts. That's a huge amount of resources available through the CSR to be utilized for the development sector works, but still we are finding the lack of resources and funding. There is this whole explosion of ESG as an agenda. And the social aspect there is something where a lot of development sector work around, including nutrition, can easily fit, but I don't think we are capturing a lot of that ESG platform. Even the ICANN experience that Lawrence shared, environmental, a lot of that is something that is linking environmental, climate, and nutrition, and other sectors could be coordinated with that. But just if I can give you some stats around when we are looking at these new ways of funding opportunities around ESGs and CSR funding and other innovative financing models, there are 2 bonds that have been created around nutrition, vis-a-vis around 634 green bonds that have been created till now. There are 36 health and 40 education, social or development impact bonds, only 1 for nutrition. Almost $285 million worth of 5 health impact investment funds have been created, only 1 for nutrition. So that shows that the 1 is not equal to 45 that I said earlier, less than 1% of ODA coming for nutrition. That whole orphans sector where nutrition was falling behind is something that we are again seeing being replicated in the area of innovative financing as well, where again this is the risk of falling behind, whereas sectors like education and climate have really leapfrogged and they have gone on this innovative financing in a massive way. So that's something that I would like to draw attention upon, where there are resources. And innovative financing, we also with Palladium Impact Capital try to dig deep in terms of what are the different sort of instruments, or when we categorize those into different sort of fundings that are available. So we largely looked at 5 overarching areas. One was where it's gift, donation, and aggregation mechanisms, a bit like what we do at the Power of Nutrition. What we do is we bring different funders together, and then we use these resources to create programs with a set of, we have 12 implementing partners with us, and we co-create programs with these funders and some of the implementing partners with government, relevant government in those geographies. So that's a gift. This is the aggregation mechanism, which is one way. The second, I would say, is pay for results mechanism, where a lot of funders are trying to look at de-risking their investment early on, where they're not looking at just paying for the inputs, they're looking at the payment for the results and the outcomes that are coming out. And that's a mechanism. Again, we are looking at exploring those in few of the geographies. We are currently exploring with Save the Children an opportunity in Kenya, where we could look at outcomes-based funding contract around that to address treatment of severe acute malnutrition among children. Third, I would say, is the blended finance and impact investing. That's something where looking at catalyzing the capital from public and philanthropic sources to mobilize private capital flows. A very good example of this is something that GAIN under Lawrence leadership has been driving, is called N3F. That's where they are looking at engaging with the SME sector and looking at food systems and businesses on that aspect. So this is where we can look at the blended financing and the impact investing as a third big bucket of new sources of funding. Fourth is around market guarantees and insurance instruments, where institutions commit to cover the potential losses of an investment if they occur. And we haven't dwelled much into this, but we know that in the health and in the education sector and in the climate sector, there are innovative financing models that have been created for it. Last big bucket that we look at from these newer ways of financing is in terms of social bonds and notes in the capital market. These are mostly debt instruments that are being utilized. And there are a few examples, like on nutrition, there was a Danone nutrition bond, which was created a few years ago. So these are more or less the kind of 5 big buckets where we are looking at, where somebody mentioned about playing hockey and being where the puck will be as we go ahead. These are new hockey fields itself where we can go and play. And I don't think the nutrition sector has done that enough, or there are a few early stakeholders and initiatives that are being done, but a lot of it still needs to be explored and done as we go ahead. I would go towards the last section of what I want to say is, yes, these are opportunities, and we are trying to look at those opportunities and work out what we can do. But what we are going to focus more and more in the years to come is build on what we have done in the last 7 years. So what we have done in the last 7 years is looking at this whole core model where we had this pooling of resources, funding from different funders coming together. So that's what we are trying to do as we go more and more in our programming in the years ahead. There would be some changes that we are trying to do in that. One change would be that instead of focusing on just few sectors, like we were a lot health systems heavy, now we are expanding. We are working in the areas of water sanitation. We are working in the area of social protection, working in the area of food systems. So we have 7 out of our 22 investments, which has food systems as a component. Small component, we want to make it a bigger component as we go ahead, but yes, food systems, early childhood development. We are looking at how can we link with climate, how can we link with education. So these are other hockey fields or football fields that we can and should go and play, because nutrition is something, as I said earlier, 2 is equal to 70. Nutrition is impacted by so many other sectors, and we don't need to remain in the silo of the nutrition sector per se. Second is, what else are we going to do ahead in terms of new financing and exploring new avenues is a lot of resources that we see. I mentioned about ESG and the CSRs, but there are 2 other that I feel globally is being looked at as potentials. One is domestic resource allocation. This is government funding, and there it's not only funding that's being put for the nutrition sector, funding that's being put for nutrition sensitive agriculture, funding that has been put for wash components, funding that's been put for other components in the health system, which all impact towards the nutrition outcome. So there has to be this approach of looking at funding for nutrition, domestic resource allocation with the whole multi-sectoral approach as well. We have a huge kind of success story, 9 investments with World Bank, more than 400 million portfolio with them across Africa. We want to increase this more, but also expand this whole potential of what we have done with the Multilateral Development Bank, World Bank, do it with other opportunities like, can we expand it and replicate it with African Development Bank? Can we do that, the similar kind of a thing with Islamic Development Bank? So these are all the opportunities that we have started exploring now, and going ahead, that would be a priority where there are more resources available with the government to focus on nutrition. And there, can we make it more multi-sectoral investments rather than being focused on just health and nutrition investments. So these are some of the more focused way in which we are looking at innovative financing, but also building on what we have been seeing as a successful way of our generating resources and funding for our partnerships with so many different stakeholders. Yeah, so we have 7 out of our 22 programs where there's some aspect of food systems at this point of time, and I shared a lot of things today more from the nutrition aspect, and I know the conference discussion is on the food systems, but I don't think anything that I said on nutrition focus is not relevant for the food systems. In fact, it can be more aspects can be added on top of that. So yeah, let's go and play on all the different football fields and hockey fields and all the other fields, but that's the way forward to get more resources, because the resources in the traditional grant aid funding is just going down and down and down, and we have to expand. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Oh, question, yes. Did you ask me a question?
So I wanted to ask a question after Lawrence's talk, and I'm not sure if he's still here. But I'm very much
He's not online.
He's not, he's gone already. Okay. So but I very much like my ears prick up whenever I hear the word wash, because I do a lot of research on wash. So my name is Hugh Waddington. I'm with Lunch for the I do tropical medicine and the Action Against Sensitive. So what I actually wanted to pick up with Lauren. So Alex mentioned the importance of WASH. We call these in the research speak nutrition sensitive interventions. So they're the interventions which help secure nutrition but don't directly provide food or additional nutrition to children. They provide the environment to reduce, for example, reduce disease. So, for example, how does WASH do that? By providing, if you provide people water supplies, they can wash more, which means that their children are less likely to suffer from infection and therefore become undernourished. Sorry, I'm getting to the point. So my point was going to be to Lawrence, but he's gone now. So this ICANN work, he talked a lot about nutrition specific things, but I went to their website and it also mentions nutrition sensitive aspects. So I was going to ask to what extent were GAIN and ICANN also addressing these kind of cross-sectoral interventions, which are incredibly important. But since he's not here, I can't. So I'd like to say to Ella, totally support your comments that you made.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I mean, we can touch upon this in the panel discussion after the next talk. So let's move on to our final talk of the day. Can we wait for the panel discussion, please? Thank you. So we have our final talk of the day, which is Lord from United Against Malnutrition and Hunger. And the first chief executive joined in September 22. So you're going to tell us about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to LIDC for inviting me here. It's a huge pleasure to be with you and to take part in this important convening. And I realise that it's the 3 o'clock slot on a Thursday afternoon, but I hope you'll bear with me. And I've certainly found the discussions today, both online and since I've been here in the room, absolutely fascinating and a real enriched contribution. I think it's so important that people from different disciplines, etc., are coming together. And I'm so pleased to have been invited to speak about United Against Malnutrition and Hunger. We're a new initiative, and we're aimed at ensuring that UK expertise and resources are put back at the heart of global efforts to end malnutrition and hunger. It's hearing at the start of today from David Nabarro, who has been a real inspiration to us and a very great support in setting up this organisation, and his kind of support and his sense that bringing together people across disciplines is absolutely critical for success, because we are dealing with such complex and multifactorial issues. I just wanted to share a personal experience myself. Almost 39 years ago, on Tuesday, the 23rd of October, 1984, like millions of other British people, I was sat in front of a TV set when the lead item on the news was what became an incredibly famous report in kind of broadcasting history from northern Ethiopia. Michael Burke reporting on the famine in Tigray. And that had an immense effect on a lot of people in the UK. It led to the formation of Band Aid and Live Aid, as many of you will know. And watching it as a 14-year-old, as I was then, I was both horrified by what one saw and heard, but I was also horrified by the fact that this was happening in a world of such plenty. And these were the days of the agricultural intervention stocks and the grain mountains and butter mountains and wine lakes piled off across the continent of Europe, whilst people didn't have enough food to eat. And it occurred to me that there was something beyond the drought and conflict that was clearly exacerbating issues, but there was something much more systematic and that needed to be tackled. And with the sort of self-righteousness of a teenager, At the time, I thought, these adults, they're all, idiots. This political system is idiotic, it's terrible. I've got to do something to help. And I've hatched this plan, I think inspired by the fact I'd seen the film Gandhi that year, which had made me think if you had strong enough will, you could change anything. I hatched this plan that I would go to Ethiopia and I would somehow, I hadn't worked out how, help rescue this system that didn't work. And it probably would have remained a teenage fantasy, except for one day my dad asked me to collect some papers or something from his study. And I went down there and he had just received a new credit card and he hadn't signed it. And he had the same name as me. And I kind of took this as a sign that actually I had no choice now. I was being told, well, go and do it. And I picked up my credit card not my credit card, my father's credit card, I should say. I went upstairs to the bathroom, I locked myself in, I signed it with my signature, and I went and got my passport, and I got a bus to German Street, not too far from here, where Ethiopian Airlines had an office, and I bought an airline ticket to Ethiopia, and I somehow managed to get myself a visa. I don't know how common it was for a 15-year-old boy to apply for visas, but I think given everything that was going on with these pop stars appearing and everything that people dealt with it. And I got on a plane to Ethiopia. And you won't be surprised to learn that when I arrived, I discovered that the demand for unskilled 15-year-old English kids wasn't huge. And also, of course, that Ethiopia at the time under the Mengistu regime was a pretty scary place to be. Luckily, I was rescued from this situation by an Anglican clergyman. My father was an Anglican clergyman, in fact, and so they had a kind of Anglican network. And he found me at a crucial point, allowed me to stay a while to learn a little bit about the country, but said to me, you need to go home, but if you learn some skills, remember these issues, they don't go away. And sadly, they haven't, although much success and progress has been made in the time since then. So we must never get trapped in the idea that we can do nothing about it. But I realized from that experience how important politics and political systems were in all of this, and how many factors came together in terms of trying to change things. And I've been particularly struck when the government insisted that VAT had to be paid on the proceeds of the Band-Aid record. And Bob Geldof said that's not happening. That is not happening. People are not spending their money to give a load of money to the government. And the government was intransigent, but they backed down. They didn't let the VAT off, but they donated it to the Band-Aid campaign. And I realized, yes, through collective action, you can get change. So when I came back, I got involved in NGOs, which is to Save the Children, as a volunteer, but then into politics. And I was the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Prime Minister in the coalition government when we reached the 0.7 target, and when the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, to his credit, did much on the nutrition agenda. Sadly, since then, and comparatively recently, because that was continued by subsequent governments, we've had the massive cuts in the ODA budget. We've had disproportionate cuts of 80% in nutrition, global nutrition spending. And those funding cuts obviously were devastating for the programs and partnerships being built over time. But just as important, they coincided with the UK just stepping away from the role that it had previously played as a galvanizer of action on malnutrition and hunger. I think it was probably a role that many of us had taken too much for granted. And it's against that background that the idea for United Against Malnutrition and Hunger was formed after consultation with NGOs and others in the sector. There was felt that there was a bit of a gap, and that an organisation that could work alongside other advocates across the sector, complementing and amplifying their work, but always maintaining a single focus on restoring the UK to the heart of global efforts to combat malnutrition and hunger was something that was needed to raise that political profile all the time in the UK. So to help make that happen, our aim at United Against Malnutrition and Hunger is to bring together British expertise and knowledge to champion comprehensive and cost-effective solutions to global crisis of malnutrition and hunger in partnership with similar expertise around the world, and tackling both the immediate issues and also the longer term. We want to work with others to highlight cost-effective, scalable interventions that save lives and make sustained progress on malnutrition and hunger. And we want to work with others like yourselves and in this room and outside to ensure that the UK plays its role in global efforts to transform food systems and to help get the world back on track towards eradicating malnutrition and hunger. I should say that there has been some progress in the sense that at least we have a minister in government again through Andrew Mitchell, who is really engaged in this issue. We don't have the resources and we don't have some of the things we want, but we at least have that, and that's a good thing. So I pay tribute to him for that. Our alliance is aiming to draw people together from scientific, business, finance, military, diplomatic, faith and civil society backgrounds with cross-party support to demonstrate the real breadth of commitment to this issue throughout British society and to use those voices to champion action. Because we're united in the belief that tackling global malnutrition and hunger is not only the right thing to do for the world, but it's also in the UK's strategic national interest. And for us, this means the UK mobilising the full breadth of expertise and resources to save lives and provide sustainable solutions to hunger and malnutrition. It means creating new partnerships between government, business, private finance and science to drive innovation and maximise impact. And it means restoring funding and research programmes and using that renewed support to leverage additional finance along some of the ways that Alec mentioned and to drive international action. We were formally launched on the 1st of March this year with generous support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Eleanor Cook Foundation, and we're currently building a small team to take forward our mission. Our second full-time employee and our second will start next month. But alongside our executive team and our board, we've also are building an advisory council to bring together that sort of expertise across sectors that I've mentioned. We've been recently involved with a number of NGOs and philanthropic organisations with efforts to put together an investment case for the UK government, which will set out an ambitious but pragmatic programme of action on global malnutrition and hunger. And I hope that as we develop that proposal, we'll be able to engage with speakers and participants from this event to draw on all your knowledge and expertise to inform that document, and particularly around food systems transformation. Finally, in conclusion, my experience in Ethiopia in 1985 and subsequently living and working in Zimbabwe and then South Africa really taught me that real and lasting change doesn't come from standing on your own, however passionate you may believe in your cause. It comes when you stand together with others. And when across sectors and disciplines and communities and faiths, you can share expertise, resources, and above all, a collective determination to bring about change. And that is what United Against Malnutrition and Hunger is really about. Working with those leaders I've mentioned in business, science, philanthropy, civil society, faith, military, diplomatic sectors to bring about that change. Because the scale of need makes malnutrition and hunger an issue that simply has to cross politics. It has to cross sectors, has to cross faiths. It requires, as you've been discussing today, systems transformations which are complex and challenging. And it demands all of us to work together, united against malnutrition and hunger, and determined to turn the tide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. And that concludes the session. We will now take a break and reconvene at 3:35 panel discussion. Great.
policy tool can really help policymakers think through how the actions and commitments to action that they're making can help deliver.
So that's for nutrition.
So, and partially what I'm going to ask is going to be controversial, but this theme really plays my mind. That's why I would want to use a reference to ask. Researchers highlighted how big corporations like Amazon have unequal issues and they contribute to climate change by a lot, and also most of human health and human rights issues. But they also have, subsidiary organizations like foundation, the Earth Fund, which funds projects to mitigate climate change. So, is that not, when projects receive funding from the Earth Fund, for example, is that not a conflict of interest in a way? And I want to understand how is it, and there are other organizations, that I could but I would choose not to. How would you say this is a just financing mechanism?
Thanks, Ashwini, for the question. And there has to be a few things like in terms of the due diligence. So when we are working across different sort of stakeholders, we have our due diligence for implementing partners through whom we implement the programs. But at the same time, we have due diligence for the funders to whom we accept the funding as well. And then there's due diligence of the implementing partner through whom we implement the program. They also have to be okay with what funding is coming to whom. So if you look at the kind of implementing partners we work with, UNICEF, Save the Children, so all 12 of them, they have their own strict due diligence process. So any funder that we engage with and we get resources with has to go through our due diligence, and the implementing partner has to be acceptable with that funding as well. But if you ask me, nutrition and specialty food is at a very unique place where this kind of a conflict of interest scenario rises more and more vis-a-vis many other development sectors. And best milk substitute, if you look at that, hardly there would be any development partner, ING or development partner in the area of nutrition who would engage with funding resources which has funding source from those locations. And I think something similar is pretty important and critical to keep in mind when you're looking at where is the source of the funding coming from. So nutrition sector, food systems, all of these have more of this to do the due diligence around compared to some of the other development sector aspects in a way.
I'm glad you picked up on the breast milk example, because that's the area that I work extensively in, and I have seen conflict of interest and a lot of involvement by Nestle in a lot of these research projects. Thank you so much for answering.
Thank you.
Any other audience questions for our panel? I'm sorry, but I cannot ask them. Maybe because I just joined. Do you have them?
I have the questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, so maybe, yeah,
Yeah,
can you,
These are the most recent ones.
can you read them out?
Okay. Let's see, so there are some questions about use of phones in food industry. I'm not sure which presentation that relates to.
I think that was going back to the talk with digital agriculture and African development.
Can you see them all of them?
Okay.
There is one, will powerful actors, producers and marketers, involved in ultra-processed foods be willing to lose markets to sustainable and healthy diets, especially in the context of moving from global trade to more localized trade in food? I think that was from an earlier presentation as well. Maybe if there's some more questions from the audience.
Dylan, I had a few questions on my last slide. Maybe can we show that?
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to take a sort of chair's prerogative with the next. We had a whole variety of different discussions today, right? We started with David Navarro, who was really telling us that behind the scenes, there's much more going on than sort of the public discourse. And if you read the public discourse, you're not going to really understand all of the really positive things that are happening, which that was a very positive way to start out. And he was really telling us that it was about connections and interdisciplinarity. And that kind of flowed through the day, this notion of connections and interdisciplinarity. But one of the things that I think didn't really come across, we saw some frameworks. We saw actually quite a few frameworks. We saw quite a few we know the challenges, right? The challenges were outlined, but it's that tweaking that pathway. You know, we don't, yes, it'd be great. Everybody can get in a room and discuss and talk and we need, but it's getting that pathway to action that's often missing. So you come from very different sectors, and I'm going to throw you in this one, Anissa, because you're in this academic, like moving into the policy space. What do you think we can do? What do you think we can do to move this forward? Because personally, I think we're at a food systems tipping point. I don't think we have the luxury of time. I don't think we have the luxury of time for either incremental science to incrementally get us to these unwrapping these grand challenges. I don't think we have the time for these kind of incremental, we're going to have a meeting, then we're going to have another meeting, and then we're going to have another meeting, and then we're finally, almost the UN processes, you know, and we can see that in the COPs. You know, yes, we get some places, but overall, are they really, you know, where are we now with climate change? It's the same thing. So my question to the panel is, and this is a tough one, how do we move from where we are to where we want to be relatively quickly? So, voice.
You want me to?
Yeah.
Actually have some questions here that relate to that, so I don't know if I should
Okay.
jump in now.
No, we can wait. Let's try this.
Oh, that is a tough one.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had the answer, we would be doing it already.
What can be done quicker, faster? What's the low-hanging fruit in food systems that's going to enable us to get to a different, you know, we're talking about a complete and utter transformation. And what we've seen today is the ideas are there, but the pathways for that complete and utter transformation are not yet solid. So what's your experience? What would be your recommendation? What do you think the priority is?
Well, from what we focus on, you know, a big part of it is policy action, putting in place the right policies that provide the enabling environment for all other actors to also be able to move forward with the actions that they need to take. You know, and we are really not seeing any examples, concrete examples. And I think Tim also referred to the same thing. I'd be actually curious to see if you have examples, because there are a lot of meetings, a lot of dialogues. Where, you know, we are not really seeing any governments moving forward with this agenda concretely anywhere in the world. So that's where we're hoping things can start to change. You know, and as you said, we do have some ideas, but we need to put them into action from the outset. And for us, again, a big part of it is to, you know, do that collectively with farmers organizations, with others at national level. And that's a lot of what we are going to focus on in the next phase of JRT program, is to focus in a few countries, bring together actors to co-develop and co-design that kind of vision of change for the country that is really, you know, that there is buy-in for from all actors. That is not something that is being, you know, developed in ministries without any input from people. And then really kind of channel the right resources towards implementing those. And I think at that point, we really need to look at all different, you know, types of financing and resources. As I mentioned, you know, in my presentation, obviously there is a public support and policy, you know, the incentive mechanisms that government, but also private sector and, you know, development funds and multilateral banks, and everybody really needs to kind of be coming behind countries and support them so that they're able to move forward with their plans.
Is that different from the national action plans? Or
The
in
national
addition to-
pathways that came out of the UN Food System Summit processes, for example, I think that's a good starting point, but often they're not, you know, comprehensive, and a lot of them are, you know, really, they include incremental change, and they're not ambitious enough, they're not comprehensive enough, they are not, you know, taking a food systems approach oftentimes, even if they came out of, you know, the Food System Summit process. But, you know, the coordination hub, which now sits at the FAO and is responsible for coordinating all of this action, I think they are also very well placed to help move, you know, help countries move forward with these plans, but also improve their plans.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to segue to finance, right? So we've got a lot of sort of private sector, quasi-private sector players. We've got new matching finance. So there's more demands for finance across sort of the nutrition food system space than ever before. So everybody's getting a little bit less. So how do we deal with that? So we've got we want new ways of working, which need to be funded. We've got new mechanisms for funding, but how do we bridge that kind of, what do you think? What's your, if you had unlimited funds, what would you do?
So it'll be a bit different if there's limited fund. It'll be a bit different if you have unlimited funds. But I think the funding, if you look at the four folks that you have put on the table over here today, there is focus on policy, there's focus on advocacy, there's focus on academies, and there's focus on getting more resources, even getting programs to be implemented. I think each one of these in silo would not give you the change that you're expecting. So what I say is a continuum of evidence to policy to action. Unless we close that loop and the whole action plan is thought of this continuum. And as we are working on evidence generation, if we don't see how that evidence is going to lead to policy and implementation and action, it doesn't lead to anything. Or if somebody is working on policy or advocacy without it being backed with the evidence and without it being kind of having funded actionable plan, it would not lead to anything going beyond that. And similarly, implementation, if you're creating wonderful action plans with ministries and all, but not having funding and not having the evidence behind it, it would not lead to the impact that you're trying to look at. Another thing is, I've seen loads and loads of money being spent on pilots, creating proof of concepts. And there's a phrase I use as pilotitis or graveyard of pilots. So there have been so many of these across so many geographies. So unless you look at this whole continuum, and the financing has to look at this whole continuum to make an impact. Unfortunately, we break the entire sector. This is food systems work, this is nutrition work, this is agriculture work, this is health work, this is wash work. It's the same household, it's the same mother-child dyad who are going through this multiple deprivations. Could we create a way of addressing multiple deprivations in the household rather than breaking down? It will save so much of resources and energy that we want to apply.
No, thank you for mentioning that, because that segues nicely into the hub and the whole child approach of what we're trying to do in the hub. and trying to weave together this interdisciplinary approach around the whole child, not around these kind of separate different, but that's a whole different conference. Okay, Johnny, what do you think? What's your kind of take on that?
Well, I think it's one thing to have events like this, and others that go on around the UK and around the world, and actually ensure that those solutions and approaches are understood by politicians, and that they are engaged with in a way that they can deal with. I mean, I remember when I was at university studying politics, and I had a politics lecturer who kept going on about Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister from the 1950s, quote, when he was asked, you know, what was the hardest thing you found in politics in your career? And he's supposed to have said, events, dear boy, events. And my politics tutor used to say this with great annoyance. He used to look at him, well, what does that mean? And then I spent some time in government, and I knew what it meant, because it meant that every day when you went into the office thinking, we really got to tackle this issue, boom, along came an event. And it wasn't an event that you could not tackle. And whether it's, you know, we've seen recently, you know, the conflict in Ukraine, COVID-19, the Sudan conflict now. There is so much on the plate of politicians who, you know, they don't have the sort of broad backgrounds that people have here. They don't get to go to actually many of these sort of events and conferences and have time to learn. And the things I really learned was, one, if you want to be impactful, you've got to connect into some of the agendas that are being dealt with anyway. You've got to show why this is relevant. You know, I mean, I spent a reasonable amount of time last year in Sudan, in fact. And I mean, it's interesting how these issues, when we were talking with the civilian democratic movement at the time about if they were trying to bring themselves together, but the issue of nutrition came up a lot, the issue particularly of women's lack of access to nutrition, and all the pressures from climate, which we've heard about today, but all the pressures that was applying on Sudan's political system. So, I mean, I just think one has to think about how one connects into agendas, but one also has to package things up, you know, in simple ways for politicians, not because they're stupid, although some of them are, but lots of them are very intelligent, but because, you know, they've got to deal with everything. And then the final thing I'd say on this is, there is this tension between the speed and scale of what needs to be done and the mechanisms that we have, you know, well, frankly, particularly in democratic societies, to kind of move, because there are lots of constraints on politicians. But I would say in general, first of all, you can't do everything until you first do something. And it's really important. I think your point about low-hanging fruits, what are the things? I mentioned this sort of investment case that we're thinking about. What are some things that can be ambitious but pragmatic to get? So you build that sense. You know, it's like if you've got to clear out an old house or something. If you look at the whole thing, you go, oh, I can't do it, I'm going. But if you say, well, I do one room or one corner of a room, you know, you can get the momentum. And I think getting the momentum and getting some successes is really important. And lastly, I promise, I think talking about success as well as scale of challenge is really important, because otherwise, not just politicians, but the whole of society can disengage.
Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Nisa.
I would like to build upon these points, because there's a lot of, from an academic scientific background, there is a lot of information out there. We have a lot of data already, and it's almost too much for one person to process. And packaging up these messages is very important. We need to, as scientists, we need to be able to tell our story, to say what's important about our work, and to package it up in a way that's understandable to other people, because we talked a lot today about dialogues between different stakeholders, between different sectors, and I'm not a climate expert, but if somebody comes to me with a load of climate data, I need them to summarize it for me so that I understand it. And I have to do the same for other people with my expertise. And I think we can all do that. That's what we've been doing today. We've been different expertise, different backgrounds have all come together to summarize their main points and to share that information. And I think there's also a sort of sense of ownership that comes with this too, a sense of responsibility. There's not one person that can change all food systems. We all have to chip in. We all are stakeholders at the same time as being change makers. So it's on a personal level, we can identify what we can do ourselves. And I think Tim mentioned this as well, but there's also power in collective action. So what do we do when we come together? It's good to talk, but we need to have a way forward. And that's where I think the data, the scientific data can be very powerful. And if we can utilize the data that's out there, we already have massive databases that we draw upon to do research, and more data is coming out all the time. If there is a way that we can harness these data to find a direction forward or find multiple directions forward and to be able to tell people what the data mean and why they're useful, then I think we can start to see leaps in advancements in changing food systems. But it needs, again, this collective work, and to be able to talk to different people with different backgrounds, with non-scientific backgrounds, the people in your life. I mean, how many of you talk about your work with your family? I mean, I try to sometimes, but I realize by doing that it's an important conversation to start having. And we can't just talk amongst the academic community or the policy community. We have to start breaking out of these silos to even make a tiny change, the incremental change. It's not a sexy change, but it can plant a seed in other people's heads that initiates more conversations.
Sarah had her hand up, but I don't think you could see.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on the point that you mentioned about data and your point about kind of making things simpler for policymakers and, you know, giving them the right information. I just wanted to, and also celebrating successes. I just thought it's helpful to maybe talk a bit about a process that the Just Rural Transition Initiative has been supporting, and it's a series of policy dialogues that are being co-convened by the UK government and the World Bank to bring together governments from around the world as a kind of exchange network for them to share their experiences as they think about moving forward with policy reform. And that policy dialogue has been kind of going on for the last 2 years. As a result of the consultations within that group and also our consultations with a broader group of stakeholders, we launched a policy action agenda for transition to sustainable agriculture at COP26 that provides a framework of action for governments. And really the starting point, for them is to, you know, analyze your policy mix, you know, how you're supporting your food and agriculture, because a lot of governments don't even know that. They don't know where the funding is going and what the impacts are and what the impacts would be if they repurpose the policies. So that policy action agenda provides a framework of action. It wasn't negotiated. It's not supposed to be prescriptive, rather kind of a menu of action and a roadmap for governments to look at if they're interested to move forward with that agenda. So I think that was a kind of a success story that maybe we should celebrate, but we are really hoping to see then some of those governments who have endorsed the policy action agenda and are engaging in these policy dialogues would now take that forward.
Thank you. Oh, great, perfect. So I think that, you know, interdisciplinarity got raised a lot today. And in some ways, we think it's the panacea. We think this is the, you know, if everybody kind of works together. And from a research community perspective, I would say I started my first interdisciplinary unit in the UK in 2001. And people thought I was crazy. I had like a linguist, a philosopher, a digital media. I mean, I would just went, it was like, those were the heady days when it was lots of research funding. So, and I would say sort of 20 years later, here we are. We struggle with the same struggles of interdisciplinarity. We struggle with the same way to work together. We struggle to bring natural scientists and social sciences together in an equal way. We struggle to have different sort of backgrounds and expertise dominate a discussion. And then we also struggle to combine and harmonize data in a way that's useful. And I think that we have got to put more time into moving away from the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity to the reality of how we can unleash the power of it. And I think that this is very true in food systems. It's probably more true because you have this complex dynamic system. You've got loads of data around that, but your means and mechanisms and ways to match and to use that data to get that to policymakers is more limited than it should be at this particular time. We need more resources to understand both the limitations and this kind of ability or successes of interdisciplinary inquiries to answer or solve a problem. So that would be my plea going into this. I think that there's a lot more that we can do from the kind of scientific community to better understand and unpack and be more self-reflective about interdisciplinarity and how we use it. And I think it's part of this wider, it's like, you know, it's such a great handout because each one of you guys, you're right, like Alec mentioned, you're here and you've got the answer, you've got the connection. So yeah, and the other thing that I mean, many years ago, I wrote this paper on mosaics. And I said, there's so much research that's been done, so much scientific research been done. Why aren't we better mapping out what's been done, what isn't, look at the gaps. So you're filling in the pieces of the puzzle, and then you've got the solution space. I don't think anybody read that paper, I'm going to be honest. Wasn't a very popular one, but I have to say, if we're still in that same space, we're still generating lots of evidence, we're not connecting the dots, and we're not getting kind of scientific evidence using that low-hanging fruit to combine it to solve something. And I think that we need to shift the mindset of the way that we do research. So along with these other kinds of challenges around food systems, we need to, I think, really fundamentally look at how we're using and applying interdisciplinarity into these spaces to be better able to inform both advocacies, policies, and research itself as the answers, the solution. So yeah, that's one of it. So we've got, I think we've got one. Oh, we've got one question. Oh, go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for a good discussion innovation very interesting. So, but I think that most often we used to talk, but I think definitely we have to take some actions to make things move forward. So, if maybe or me or anybody in this room where say yes after this meeting, if I were to take one action, yes, to start making things change, what would that action be? That's my question.
Okay, well, we're going to turn that on to you. What would you start? What would your one action be? What would you do first? Go ahead.
Maybe I will need some help from you.
Yeah. Where do you think? Where would you start? Where's the biggest starting point? Policy, research. What do you think? I mean, personally, okay, go ahead.
I've got a thought.
Okay.
It's kind of linked to your comment about your papers.
Sorry, could you hold that thought? In the interest of gender equality, we did have a hand up here.
I'm so sorry.
So, I'm just.
Yeah. I was going to say that we have so much data already from research. And research is going on, about the topic we're talking about. Who are the people who produce the food? Is it not, for instance, in Africa, people produce food and many peasant farmers? There is a huge disconnect between what's going on with this sustainable development goals, food, what do they call it, food security, food system, and the people who actually produce the food on the ground. I'm taking Africa, which I'm familiar with, as an example. What programs do we have to engage these people or to help them produce more food? Because I can tell you, the situation in Africa is getting even worse. They're producing less food, they're wasting more food. There's a lot of harsh conditions already. So we are not getting anywhere. I'm looking at this 2030, when you're supposed to have achieved so much with the sustainable development goals. I don't think we will get anywhere in Africa. So how do we connect the two? We said we can up there, sustainable, and the people on the ground. What do we do to connect the two groups? That's my own question.
We had that question in the chat from Mark Spires, if he's still here. So I think that, yeah, that ties in. So just so he knows that we are funneling his question via Mama Jane to you.
The panel wants to discuss.
I mean, I'll have a go. I think this is a really important issue, because, you know, things don't happen up here, you know, in Bloomsbury. They've got to happen on the ground, and as you absolutely say, you know, it's in those communities where the food are grown and the people who are doing it. I think one of the things that we have got to be very aware of is that nothing can be achieved effectively and sustainably if it's not done in partnership and genuine partnership. And that's at, you know, national, international, national level, subnational level, local level, and ensuring that these sort of things are meaningful in you know, in the communities that have to actually implement them. One of the things that I really reflected on earlier this year, I was in South Africa as part of a parliamentary delegation, and we were talking about the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And I realized that it wasn't seen as a partnership at all. It was seen as a neo-colonial attempt to impose our views on South Africa, and I was, you know, told in no uncertain terms what was kind of thought of that. And you know, all the language is about partnership, but the reality wasn't, because the reality wasn't actually understanding, you know, what the issues were. And you know, I was horrified to discover when I asked some questions in the UK Parliament about what was the UK government doing to support the Just Energy Transition Partnership, that this was seen in South Africa as me criticising South Africa, which was actually the opposite of what I was trying to do. But, you know, it really struck me that I hadn't understood at all, really, the issues that were being faced. And that is what genuine partnership is about. It's actually about understanding what's practical and what's real and what's not just a sort of fantasy thought up here in it. You know, I mean, I remember I was a teacher in a rural part of Zimbabwe a long, long time ago, when the government, it was in 1988, and the government issued a decree that corporal punishment in school was no longer allowed. It was something that I supported. I mean, we never practiced it, but in that community, it was seen as completely divorced because nobody had discussed it. Nobody had it come from the top, but it was like, and to be honest, they just laughed at it, like, well, that's not. And unless you connect with realities, unless you engage, and etc., that goes international level, national level, and you're prepared not just to talk about partnership, but to understand that partnership means listening to other people and understanding they often have more knowledge and more important knowledge than you do.
Can I also build on that quickly? Do we have time?
Yeah.
Do we have time? Yeah, of course. So completely agree with all of that. And obviously farmers, as I'm sure you know, are, there are all types of different farmers and farming systems and scales. And sometimes I think we talk simplistically about having farmers at a table or listening to farmers, within our community. But one of the things kind of I've learned over the last couple of years from this process of kind of being involved with the Just Road transition, it's been about, farmers organizations that are truly representative at different levels, be it global, regional, or national, even local, are really a good way to make sure farmers are included and listened to. But often they lack capacity, they lack resources. They're very small organizations that are often very stretched. They don't have access to all the regional, national, global fora where these discussions are happening. So for us, one concrete way in which we want to kind of change things and bring farmers in is helping, channel funding towards these organizations so that they can build their institutional capacity. They can, work with their members to collectively form, policy positions, and then have the capacity to actually advocate for those policy positions at different levels, be it national or, again, regional, international. That for me has been kind of something concrete that I think we can do. And I encourage others also in their work to, think about how they can engage with these farmers organizations that are representative as a kind of a conduit into, bringing farmers in.
Are we going to hear Hugh's thought, or shall we go?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll have like 2 minutes.
It was really interesting because I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, but I did hear the mama. So the point you made is very similar to the one that I wanted to say. So you're talking about participation and ownership, as I understand it. There are serious approaches and methods that have been developed for engaging stakeholders. So I'm a researcher, so let's look at the research side. For engaging the stakeholders, whether they are like big person policymaker or they are farmer in field, and these have been developed and they are used, but essentially there needs to be like serious engagement with these processes, and it's in researchers' interest to engage with these processes because it means that the work you do is actually relevant, is not just like good for your career and getting your publications out, but actually is going to use for want of a better term, make the world a better place. And there are these approaches, and perhaps in the research community, perhaps they're kind of siloed a bit in some fields, but I wonder if researchers have maybe perhaps they feel like they've got so much to do that they'd rather do dissemination rather than stakeholder engagement. And stakeholder engagement means from the start of the project, not at the end of it. So you get feedback into even just the basic research questions you're asking.
Third, can I ask a question? Given that we want, it's right to have farmers and people growing up to be involved in the process. Because they are one of our main stakeholders, but do you think that given the power dynamic, they can ever, it can ever be equitable or like respectful in a sense? I am just picking up on the gesture he made, policy person, farmer, given that's what we inherently associate them at, the level, will, if they are even brought in paper, will the deliberation ever be equal and equitable?
There's a question from the front.
I have about 3 questions. From this, firstly, I'm very nutrition, and so the first question is, we hear a lot about, I've been hearing, understanding a lot about like the funding and the working together and all of that. But I recall that like right at the beginning, I think it was Tim who spoke about ideological change. So my first question is like, what's the point of advocating for partnership and funding if there's no ideological change, and how do we go about getting that? Second question is like the people who are on the ground, like the farmers and all of that. How do you go about motivating people to invest in agricultural sectors, and that when at the same time they are facing land loss, water resource loss, because you're kind of saying, okay, let's invest in this sector, and then your entire livelihood depends on it, and then that is also disappearing at the same time. So yes, there will be that long-term change, but at the moment there's very real problems. Okay, yeah, I'll just say one more. Yeah, while we're in the middle of our incremental changes and that, what are the protective factors that are currently in place so that while we're still achieving this wider change, we're still safeguarding people who are currently being affected?
Right, thank you very much. So who on the panel wants to start with who, with what question? I mean, I think these equity issues are plagued, global development for the past, 60 years. And they're not necessarily going to be resolved. And we can have different tools and approaches, and we can make things, the participatory development paradigm, which has moved into subsequent, how do you get the voices of people who are marginalized? I worked with a linguist and I worked with a psychologist, and we studied participation, and we studied who got to attend meetings at the community level, and then more importantly, who actually got to speak. And then the linguist worked out that as the person of power around a circle, as you moved closer to the person of power, the answers or the responses got much more aligned with the person of power, right? So, and then, when you go and you interview people at the level, you realize that a lot of very marginalized people aren't invited to that meeting because they don't get to come to that meeting, because everyone has an agenda. Everyone, it's implicit in humans. We all have an agenda. So I think it's one of these things that, we can study it and we can try to understand it, and we can try to make it better. But, that's our task. That's our task in global development. But I think your questions, I hope that's okay. I think your questions, you bring a lot of the same kind of, how do you get from the rhetoric to actual reality to actual action that's going to make a difference on the ground. And I think that's something that our panelists might want to speak to. What do you think?
I'm happy to, conscious of the politician. Always happy to speak. Any conscious of that, but I'll try and be brief. I mean, I think one of the things I mentioned in my comments at the beginning was that we are looking with others at this sort of pragmatic, ambitious but pragmatic investment case. I think that's part of like a step. Okay, so what do you want us to do? Yes, we know you want us to deliver you 0.7. We want you to, but what do you want us to do that, And so that's a pragmatic thing that we can do, and we're going to work on, and hopefully with the help of some of you in this room. On the ideological, I mean, a few years ago, I was invited in to speak at a school to sixth form students. And after I'd agreed, I was told that they broke for like 45 minutes. And there were like 4 or 5 things they could go to. So I had to have a title for my talk that would attract them, because it was literally a popularity contest, which they hadn't told me before I agreed to do it. But I chose as the subject for what I would speak about was how I changed the world and how you can too. And that seemed to work as a title, because if anything, they thought, who is this arrogant member of the House of Lords who thinks he changed the world? But the point actually I was making was nobody changes the world on their own. They change it with other people. but the world never gets changed unless somebody starts, somebody who probably at the point they start trying to shift that ideological position, whether it was on, you know, women's vote or civil rights or any of these sort of big issues, they're probably derided at the beginning and, you know, seen even in their own communities a minority, but they build that support and they build it. And I think to get the sort of shifts we need, you need action on all sorts of levels. And, you know, and it's a question to all of us about how we get involved in that action, because it won't happen if we just wait for the other person who's waiting for us, who's waiting for us. You know, it kind of has to start somewhere. And one of the things that I reflect on is in the 2010 to 2017 government, 2010 to 2015 coalition government, when we moved to 0.7% of ODA, yeah, that came after a long period in which governments of, you know, the Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem had moved. And the reason they'd moved was not just because they realised it was the right thing to do, or they avoid making any partisan points, but one of the reasons they moved was because there was a big upswelling of public feeling. You know, there was this Make Poverty History campaign. There was, you know, you could, everywhere you walked in you know, the 2000s, you saw churches with the banners saying Make Poverty History. You had all of that. You had pressure on politicians. Now, if you talk to people who genuinely want to be doing the right things, MPs, they will say to you, no one comes into my constituency surgery anymore to say, you need to be acting on this issue. No one does. Sometimes there's a sort of rally in Parliament, you know, that's organised by some of the NGOs. Nobody's doing it locally, and they used to, but people are coming in saying, we are suffering, we can't afford, you know, our heating bill, or why are you spending this money elsewhere? And so I think, you know, in a democracy, politicians don't exist in a vacuum, you know, they're bottom line votes. And we've all got to be part of, you know, trying to galvanise action, trying to show that, you know, a lot of people do understand, as I said, there are things that are the right thing to do for the world, but they're also in our interest. You know, they're not about us being charitable, actually, they're about us, you know, acting collectively to make a better and safer world for all of us. But we've all got to play our part in it, and that's how you get ideological change.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and go ahead. And then Anissa's gonna close, right? Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to say one quick thing about ideological change, to say, you know, yes, that takes time, but there are a lot of tools and processes at our disposal to build consensus and achieve, you know, results in the meantime. So you don't necessarily need to kind of shift everyone's ideology. You know, if you look at the history of, for example, environmental conflict resolution, there are a lot of examples where if you bring those stakeholders together, provide a space, enable and empower everybody to contribute equally, you can still, you know, shift people's positions without necessarily completely shifting their ideology. And this is a really interesting field and, you know, potential career option for a lot of people, which is really interesting. There is one example in Switzerland very recently, and over there the discourse is very polarized between farmers and environmental groups. And there is one example whereby one of our partners actually convened a series of citizen assemblies and in parallel commissioned scientific research. And what happened at the end was the outcomes and findings of both processes were very, very similar. And the citizen assemblies brought together farmers, citizens, environmental groups, and they started from very, very different views. But at the end, they came, you know, to the same position that they could all live with. And it might not be ideal, but it's something everybody could live with. And I think that's a really good example of how you can still, you know, drive change without necessarily completely shifting, you know, ideology.
I was coming back a bit on the ideology point again, and it was to do with, if you like, the constituents coming into CNUN and the way in which our politics are driven. And I absolutely get business was translating an awful lot, but it is a long term, but yet it's not, because it's the urgency to act. And I think in part our political system acts against that, because of course people are thinking about the next election, and that becomes the driver, so everything becomes very short term. And I wonder if there's any scope for, I mean, ideally something like nutrition would not be a political issue, it would be a cross-party agreed issue. And if there's something about those, I think a lot of it's about our structures and the way in which we're organised, and there is no ministry for nutrition, you can always get sidelined because it cuts across so many different areas, of disciplinary approach. But I feel as though, again, from a systems approach, but maybe a slightly looking at it differently, you know, a political system approach, we should be tackling this, we should be thinking about it, because it's completely fundamental. We can't feed our people. We are ultimately doomed, aren't we? And we've got climate change as well. So I mean, it's more, I don't know if there's an answer to that. But it's one of the things that often concerns me, and I feel like there could be some kind of answer.
Well, I mean, I think there is, which is leadership. And it requires leadership, and I think even in a democracy, you can have leadership that such, and we did have a broad consensus, for example, on the 0.7. You know, we did, I mean, and of course there was much more that needed to be done, and there's lots of things to do, but it requires leadership. And you know, we have had some good leadership in the past, and we've had some very, very bad lack of leadership. But of course, if you have a populist government, you are not going to take long-term decisions. You're going to pretend that, you know, all the things that everybody wants can be done with no cost. I'm always carrying my wallet. I've got my wallet on me now. I've got it here. I always carry my wallet. This. It's an Argentine banknote, and it has Eva Perón on it. Because Juan Perón and Eva Perón, you know, when they came to power, or when Juan Perón came to power in 1945, Argentina was one of the richest per capita nations in the world. And they had a series of populist governments, and they are not anymore. That can happen to any country. If you start believing people when they say, you can have this and you don't have to pay for it. You know, we saw a bit of it last year. But if you have leaders who say, you know, there are some tough decisions that we have to take together, you know, we have shown in this country and in other countries around the world that that actually can prove popular as opposed to populist. But it's people who've got the courage and the vision to sort of lead, and there needs to be also you know, public engagement in that as well. But I think it is possible, but it's hard in a democracy to take long-term decisions, definitely.
But I guess the question is, where do we find those leaders who feel that they've got the knowledge and we're trying to give them the policy advice, but we're obviously not doing that well enough, or anyway, it's all information.
All right, thank you very much. I think this is fascinating, and thank you for joining into this conversation. So Anissa, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, all the points that I wanted to raise at the end, we've kind of already discussed in the panel discussion, but we've cut across a lot of topics today. And I mean, business, economics, political aspects of food systems, and food as a human right. These are all things that I guess we know about in the back of our minds, but I'm glad that today we were able to bring them to the front to discuss them openly. And as it was David Nabarro who said in his talk earlier, that the only way to find resolutions is to open dialogue at all levels. And I hope that these kinds of meetings are just the start of these dialogues. I hope that now we can take the dialogues we've had today, take them away and start conversations with other people. I hope from a scientific perspective, I hope that we can talk about these issues around data and how we can use the data to find solutions. I hope that scientists can then go to the policymakers and be able to convey these messages clearly so that we can actually enact some change. And I know that we're all going to go away now, and then tomorrow this will be another event that we've attended. But I hope, I guess my call to action for all of you for today is do something tomorrow. Just do something small. It's better than doing nothing. And if we keep doing these small actions, I really believe that collectively we can make these changes, and it's making that daily commitment every day. And perhaps that's an ideology.
Well done, everybody, and really thank you to our panel. And you've been an absolutely brilliant co-host today. Thank you so much, Anissa. We've so enjoyed co-hosting this conference.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, and I just want really few big thanks to the LIDC crew, particularly the photographer over there, Natalia, and particularly that man there who've been absolutely stalwart in putting this together. And thanks Shireen and Good and Cindy for coming today and helping out. And I hope you guys enjoyed our day. And like Anissa says, I'm going to echo that. Let's start to make change.
Thank you.
Having some more